Hey everyone, welcome to part 4 of my review of Patrick Hoban's book Road to the King. Let's get started. Part 4 today is about technical play. If you haven't watched the last 3 parts of my review, I recommend going back and doing that now. But anyways, going into this part of the book, when I was about to read, I was kind of thinking to myself, damn, if I had to write a Yu-Gi-Oh book, this would probably be the hardest part to write because technical play, particularly in Yu-Gi-Oh, I feel like it changes so much from like year to year, like what kind of thought process you have to do to come up with the correct plays. That I think it's very difficult to talk about conceptually. It almost better demonstrated by examples, really than like sort of pure theory. And now having read the section, I'll sort of get into why I think that. So first he talks about in-game resources. First one, he lists his card advantage, and he doesn't, directly come out and say like, "Oh, card advantage is useless," kind of a thing, but he does emphasize its lack of practical importance, which I'm happy about. When I did my video, I don't know, about half a year ago on modern Yu-Gi-Oh, that was something that I just directly came out and said card advantage doesn't exist anymore. Um, so he didn't go quite that far. It is possible, maybe in 2020, card advantage will be how you win Yu-Gi-Oh again. Who knows? So, since he's trying to write more of a timeless book and not sort of focusing on the now, I think he made the right call here. He discussed card advantage. He let people know, what it is, that it exists. Here's the definition. But at the same time, he did kind of talk about the pitfalls. So I actually think that section was pretty good. Maybe he could have just had something in there about the conditions where it's more or less important, because I think a lot of players get led down the wrong path when they focus too much or too little on card advantage. So if he is trying to help players improve, I think there should have maybe been a bit of a mention of that, when it's more or less important. He also, he talks about tempo, which I think this section is, it's accurate. I mean, he does explain what tempo is. He gives a correct definition. But that's also something that I think has very little application to modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Like card advantage. Mainly because, the main tempo resource that we have is the normal summon. And as you'll know if you've played recently, the normal summon is not like the big important resource that it used to be, like in 2005 or 2006. Now we can just kind of just play all the things that we want. That tempo is just like not really. It's just not really a thing. It is certainly, it has its applications sometimes, but I think that's another thing where he could have said, hey, this used to be important. It isn't so important, as I'm writing it now. Here are the conditions where it is more important versus less important. But other than that, he gives a good description of what tempo is, and I think that's good because I think a lot of players would not be able to correctly or easily explain what tempo is. So I'm glad that he does manage to, clear up a bit of misinformation there. He also talks briefly about the philosophy of fire. That comes from a very old Magic article by Mike Flores. He writes 3 paragraphs in total on it, and if you're like me and you're already familiar with the philosophy of fire, it just sort of rehashes what I already know, which is good. If you've never heard of it before, I think it might be a little difficult to understand and really know why he put it in there, because there have been very few decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Historically speaking that have really followed the philosophy of fire. The only one I can think of at the moment that really had that same approach that Magic decks did is the Justin Womack Nationals deck in 2007. So if you don't know what that is, I'll probably like link that deck in the description somewhere. But that deck from 2007 is like the only true Philosophy of Fire deck in Yu-Gi-Oh, and I think just because of the game mechanics, it's hard to like build that kind of sort of sly sort of aggro burn hybrid deck. I guess Chainburn you could also classify as like a Philosophy of Fire deck. Um, so yeah, after that he talks about, the next section's called Role in a Game. Talks about the deciding factors, and he lists the three deciding factors as life points, attrition, and a lock. Which yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Those are pretty much the three deciding factors. So not much to say there. I think he did a good job. Nothing to really complain about. And then, but something that I can't complain about is then after that, after listening to those three factors, he talks about who's the beatdown, and I'm not sure if Hoban really did the best job talking about this particular subject. This is again another topic borrowed from an old Mike Flores article, and again, just because the mechanics in Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh are so different. I actually think I'm a good person to talk about this subject since I've played both games quite competitively. I know Hoban's played Magic to some extent too, but not really the way that I have. So I think he's putting a bit of misinformation out there about like what the whole point of who's the beatdown is. He sort of lists all of these factors that if your deck is this, then it's the beatdown. If it's not, then it's control. And yeah, Hoban says the beatdown is the role of the aggressor. The control contrasts the beatdown and is trying to survive the early game damage until it can set up. That is actually a pretty accurate definition. I'm just not sure if he really applies that own definition very well when he starts to go into more detail. So I will say in Yu-Gi-Oh in general, this idea of the beatdown versus the control, it's sometimes kind of hard to define in certain matchups, right? Like I'll give you an example. If you look at I went to YCS Atlanta. The biggest deck was the Pendulum deck. Got 29 out of the top 32 spots. I brought Monarchs, and my deck was geared towards trying to beat the Pendulum deck, of course. And when you look at that matchup, I think that's a matchup where trying to call one deck the beatdown and the other the control just like doesn't really like do it any. It's just such like a, how should I say this? It's just not using the terms very well. I'll actually tell you who's the beatdown and who's the control in that matchup. And it has nothing to do with the deck. It has everything to do with who goes first. The person who goes first is almost always the beatdown, and the person who goes second is almost always the control. In the sense that the person who goes first, they are the proactive player. They're just trying to set up the best thing that they can, and they're taking the initiative. And then the person who goes second kind of has to deal with that, right? They're trying to break up that board and then slowly take over the game. They're the control. So, that's something that like Hoban never even mentions. Like he lists all of these factors for like who's the beatdown and never mentions who is going first, which in the modern game, I think very much determines who is the beatdown. I think it's sometimes even more important than the matchup necessarily. So that's kind of a critique that I have. He sort of talks about like higher ceilings, higher turn ceilings and game ceilings, which he doesn't really define what he means. I kind of have a rough idea of what he means by that, but he says that the deck with like the higher ceiling is the control. And normally I'd view that as kind of being the other way around. In Magic, usually the deck with Well, I mean, it depends. It kind of depends, really. I think sometimes the deck with the higher ceiling is the beatdown, and sometimes it's the control. It it sort of depends. Like an example I'll give is when I play Legacy Magic, the deck that I like to play was Tin Fins, and that was a deck with a very high ceiling. I mean, you could win on turn one. You could, draw 40 cards in a turn. You could, combo kill people in all these different ways. And that deck was almost always the beatdown, even though it had the highest turn ceiling in the format and the highest game ceiling in the format. You weren't trying to outlast your opponent's aggression. You were trying to be very proactive and just put the best things in play as quickly as possible. So, and another example in Yu-Gi-Oh of the deck with the higher ceiling, I would view as being more of the beatdown than the control is back in 2010, like the Frog FTK versus the Gladiator Beast matchup. Um, Obviously, Frog FTK had a very high ceiling. You could set up, not only could you just kill your opponent on turn one, but you could set up all these different kinds of walls. You could, Unifrog and take out all of their back rows. But, the Gladiator Beast deck, being that it had so many tools to counter the Frog FTK deck, the Gladiator Beast deck was really just trying to stop the Frog FTK deck from winning, and then they would just let, a chariot lock take over the game. Um, so so yeah, I mean, I don't know if he necessarily applies this whole who's the beatdown thing well. I think fundamentally, Hoban doesn't have the best understanding of what it is, but it doesn't really matter because I think who's the beatdown is really just such a bad concept to apply to Yu-Gi-Oh in general anyways. There are some times where it's definitely relevant, like if I'm playing GOAT format and, one player is playing, Tyler Nolan's, Berserk Gorilla style aggro, and the other person's just playing a standard GOAT control deck. The Berserk Gorilla guy is obviously the beatdown, and the GOAT control guy is obviously the control. But this is really just, arguing about this. This is really just semantics. I mean, whether you call a deck a beatdown or not isn't really relevant. It just depends on making the correct plays, which is really what Mike Flores was trying to do when he brought up this concept. It wasn't about labeling a deck as correctly as the beatdown or not. Didn't matter. It was taking that and applying it to make better plays. So we'll see if he does that. So next he talks about misassignment of role, which is sort of again borrowing heavily from the Mike Flores school of thought, and he brings up a good example about where a player attacks into a Gores when they could have taken the more conservative route and played such that the Gores wouldn't have mattered. And again, some of this is just I don't think about the game the same way that other people do, but to me, for when I play, I don't really think about whether or not I should attack into Gores as who's the beatdown versus who's the control or whatever. It's more of, and here's what I think Hoban should have. I think he sort of should have redesigned this entire section and made it less about who's the beatdown versus who's the control, versus playing to win versus playing to not lose. So if you have this insurmountable position and the only way that you can lose is by attacking into a Gores, you should try to minimize your risk and play to not lose versus by not attacking into the Gores, right? Whereas, an example where you should play to win is some time where, oh my god, my opponent just has this huge advantage and it's going to be very difficult for me to win, and I've got to take this huge risk in order to do so. An example of that is, and this is a really old example. This is like a 2006 example. I was playing against Ryan Goff's Third Planet deck, is what he called it. It was his unique Dark World brew, and I was playing some sort of Cyberstein brew. And he had me crushed by every measure. He had more cards on field, more cards in hand. Our life points were about the same, but that was about it. So in this game, he has a set monster and 3 set spells or traps. Now, most of the backwards that he plays in this deck are Reckless Greeds and Jars of Greed. So I know that, all of his backwards can potentially be that. So I had a Cyberstein in my hand, and my opponent was at, whatever, like 5,500 life points or something. So having no other way to win, I summoned my Cyberstein, paid 5,000, made a Cyber Twin Dragon, thought, well, damn, the only way I can win is if my opponent has just some weak monster set that doesn't do anything. I have my Cyberstein attack into his set Magician of Faith, and then my Cyber Twin attack for game. Obviously, that only works if he has a Magician of Faith set and all of his backrows are nothing, but they were, so I won. And the reason why that was the correct play, it has nothing to do with who's the beatdown versus who's the control, but it has to do with it was my only way to win. And the reverse is kind of the example that he gives in the book, which is where the only way that this guy can possibly lose the game is if he attacks into a Gores, and he still does it anyway. So I think, he borrows a bit too many concepts from Magic, and, I say this having played Magic a lot, and it's not that these concepts are never applicable to Yu-Gi-Oh! It's that it's easy to misuse them, and they're very rarely applicable to Yu-Gi-Oh!, especially the modern game. And, even things like, inevitability talks about, who has the inevitability. It's not necessarily clear a lot of times. Like, what does inevitability really mean? In Magic, it's more applicable because the game is so much more of, about answering individual threats and just having these, a single overwhelming threat that can never be beaten. Like, if my deck has some insane, 10-mana creature in it, then, I have inevitability. All I have to do is just kill your creatures and survive until I can get to turn 10, cast my awesome 10-mana card, and there's just no way you can win. Whereas I feel like that doesn't really apply to Yu-Gi-Oh! We're not as constrained on resources, right? Like, in Yu-Gi-Oh! There isn't a card that I have to wait until turn 10 to play. Usually, things, you can play them on any turn, so I feel like inevitability, maybe there is inevitability in Yu-Gi-Oh! To some extent, but it works very, very differently than it does in Magic. So I feel like he just, kind of, read all these Magic articles and just, filled in a section about them, for the theory part, and I just don't think it works. I actually think, his book is better. This section of the book is better if you're trying to get good at Magic than it is if you're trying to get good at Yu-Gi-Oh! Because it's really just more applicable. And, the examples that he uses to demonstrate a lot of these concepts, like who's the beatdown and inevitability, in his examples he'll have, oh, player A has, Gemini Elf, the other person has La Jin and, Giant Soldier of Stone. He doesn't use hardly any examples that have modern cards in them, which to me I think kind of demonstrates how difficult it is to come up with an example where that works. He does talk about risk a little, which I think is really the concept that should have been emphasized more and not so much of who's the beatdown, because in reality, I find myself thinking more about what risks I should or shouldn't take than who's the beatdown versus not the beatdown. I think that concept is a lot more applicable to Yu-Gi-Oh! Because we just have so many powerful one-ofs that we can use at any time, whether it's Mirror Force Torrential Tribute, Heavy Storm, Dark Hole, even to some extent, Maxi, whatever it is. So, I think the risk assessment aspect of the game is just far more important, and I think that should have been emphasized a lot more, because I think that's what you need to be thinking about in order to make the correct plays. That being said, I did have a lot of criticisms about those sections there, but he does have a really good section afterwards. This section's called the Order of Operations. Not sure if that's really the best name for it, but who cares? And he sort of talks about, like, okay, when we're making plays, we need to think about, why are we doing this? And I think that's great. I think that's the perfect mentality to have. When you play a card, what are you trying to accomplish with this play? Which cards best accomplish this? What is our field going to look like when we have to accomplish this? I think thinking ahead is so important. And, that plays a lot, I think, into the whole playing to win versus playing not to lose, which is why I think he should have emphasized that in this section, because it ties into the other concepts that could be in this section so well. If I'm playing goat control and I've got, 12 cards in my deck versus my opponent's 14, I'm thinking, okay, how do I win before I deck out? Like, I'm thinking ahead, and I think that's what you need to do. And, same thing if my opponent, it sets up some, big field, they go, whatever, if they go, Domain of the Monarchs into an Ether, searching another Ether, and then it's my turn and I draw my 6, I think, okay, what do I need to do to maximize my chances of beating this Domain plus Ether lock? I think everything needs to have a purpose, and I think too many people are just playing cards because they just kind of don't know what else to do. So he talks about all of this in his book, and I think it's good that he does so. In any game, thinking ahead is so important, and card games are no exception. So he talks about that in more detail. So great section. Highly recommend reading that, the section called Order of Operations. Moving on, he has one less section before he closes out the chapter, which I think is a little strange with the placement. He calls it tournament approach. Tournament mindset. It's actually all about tournament mindset. And I say it's a little weird because that has nothing to do with technical play. He's talking about how if he's, if he's 5-0 and someone asks him what his record is, he doesn't say 5-0. He frames it as undefeated because it, makes himself feel better while he's in the tournament. And, I think that's all well and good. I mean, obviously do whatever you can to make yourself confident and, feeling like you're going to crush the next round. But I don't see what that has to do with technical play. I don't know why he put it in this chapter. The next section is actually called the mental game. So to me, or the next chapter I should say, is called the mental game. So to me, the tournament mindset part, that seems way more like it should be in the chapter about mental game and not the chapter about technical play. So, no issues with what he's saying in this section necessarily. I just think it was a bit misplaced. Don't think this was the best spot for it. I don't really think it's super important, for me at least, whether I say if I'm undefeated or 5-0. To me, I'm going to feel the same regardless. But, I think having some self-awareness is good. If what gets you tilted versus, what gets you hyped and confident, obviously you want to try to put yourself in the best mindset as possible. If that's by saying that you're undefeated instead of 5-0, obviously do that. If it's something else, do that too. So that wraps up this chapter. Next one is going to, like I said, it's called the mental game. So, think it'll be interesting to read because I think it's a topic that is not discussed too much, whereas technical play is discussed quite a lot. Overall, have some mixed feelings on this section on technical play. I think in some spots it doesn't really focus so much on what's important, but it definitely has its good points too. The parts about thinking ahead and thinking what plays should accomplish. That is definitely he hits the nail on the head with that particular section of the chapter. So let me know whether you agreed or disagreed and how I did with the comments. Peace out.